Texas Public Policy Foundation, and we're delighted to have you here with us for a fascinating discussion about the use of poisons in national policy. This is certainly something that, as a now retired U.S. Army intelligence officer, I was certainly aware of, but until I read this book, I had no idea the scale that these poisons were deployed by the former Soviet Union and today's successor state, the Russian Federation, as well as nations like the People's Republic of China and North Korea. And so it's a great honor to have today's presentation with the authors of the book, The Dancer and the Devil, Stalin, Pavlova, and the Road to the Great Pandemic. So the book covers about 100 years of history in the use of both chemical poisons and bioweapons in a way that's pretty sobering when you're done with the book and you realize just the magnitude of what's been done in the past. So if I may, I'd like to introduce the authors. We have with us John O'Neill and Sarah Wynne. John is the co-author with Sarah of the book that we're going to be discussing this afternoon. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1967. He served in Vietnam on board the Swift boats, so he was in what was then called the Brown Water Navy, right? Going up the rivers and the deltas of the Mekong, right? And probably mostly in the southern part of South Vietnam. He was decorated, of course, for his service there. He then went to University of Texas Law School, finished as the top graduate. He then had a clerkship with Chief Justice William Rehnquist at the Supreme Court, and has a really funny story about that I urge our folks from our legal department to stick around after the presentation and maybe ask about the story that is connected with Chief Justice Rehnquist. That's pretty humorous. After practicing as a litigator with an international law firm, actually, I think that's you. So I skipped a bullet point there. How terrible. So back to John O'Neill, you had several hundred cases that you tried, including representation. Now this is interesting and kind of ironic. You represented the People's Republic of China at one point successfully, but then realized perhaps what they were all about and decided not to do it ever again. Sarah Wynne is the co-author with John O'Neill, of course, of the book we're talking about. You also graduated from the University of Texas with both a law degree and an undergraduate business degree with high honors. And after practicing as a litigator with an international law firm, you decided to take up a second career as an artist. What kind of art?
Mainly acrylic art.
Okay.
Selling some galleries in the Southeast.
All right, interesting. And you live in Houston with your husband and two children. You also live in Houston too, don't you?
I do indeed.
Yeah, all right. So it was a nice drive out here.
That's right.
I'm being reminded
So-
to use the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. I do indeed.
So let me ask the two of you, why this book? I mean, this is a topic that's pretty gruesome. There's not, at least there hasn't been in the past, a lot of documentary evidence, at least not until the fall of the Soviet Union and that brief period of time when the Soviet archives were open to the public. So why this book and why now? What sparked you into writing this?
What really happened is I began with Sarah. We have written other books that are bestsellers, but I began by, I really remembered all the people I saw slaughtered in Vietnam and in Hong Kong Harbor during the Great Cultural Revolution. And I thought, well, these people shouldn't be forgotten. And so I began just sort of looking at stories. If you talk about Marxist slaughter in the 20th century, you can pick 60 million stories. These just happen to be a few. I stumbled upon the story of Anna Pavlova, and I learned that Anna Pavlova kept telling Anna Pavlova was the world's greatest dancer and probably the greatest international figure of her time in the 1920s and early 1930s. When Anna Pavlova died, she kept telling people I was poisoned. I was poisoned by the food in Paris. She said it over and over again, immediately upon climbing into a train. It remained a mystery for many years why she died. The Academy Award winner of 1932 for Best Picture is called The Grand Hotel, and it's about the mysterious death of a Russian ballerina, loosely based on Anna Pavlova. So it was one of history's great mysteries. we stumbled upon all kinds of stuff showing the operation of the Russian poison ring called Yasha's Gang, operating in Paris and using anthrax to poison a large number of people. It isn't that they were embarrassed by it, they were proud of it, very proud of it. They were all executed by Stalin in the end. So once we got Pavlova, and Pavlova was sort of the example of what was happening, she became kind of the heart of the book. Why? Well, first, Pavlova was poisoned. She was killed with anthrax, and so she leads directly into the use by Marxist states of huge bioweapons facilities, of poisons and so on, have continued long past Anna Pavlova's time to the present. Second, she was the embodiment of cultural war. In 1928, really 1925, the Soviet Union embarked upon suppressing all thoughts, ideas, and so on. Marx and Engels had said that communism needs to control the means of production, the bank, the oil company, and so on. Stalin went way beyond that, and he said, Marxism, the government, needs to control the mind of man. It needs to control the actual language that he uses. It needs to eliminate, as Stalin said, the word God. The word God itself has to be eliminated by 1935. And so he embarked upon a tremendous kill-off, not only of political opponents, but of cultural opponents, not only in Russia, but in Western Europe. In Russia, the book accounts for some of the people who produced the wrong ballets. They produced Russian ballets in 1924, 25, or they wrote accounts of Stalin that he didn't find favorable, or even that they just put on music that he didn't like. And to kill them, he had to do it secretly. And the way he did it secretly was through bioweapons like anthrax and through poisons of various kinds that are outlined in the book. Anna Pavlova was the great cultural symbol of Russia to the entire world. She danced the Nutcracker, Swan Lake, and in all of those, there's always a Russian nobleman. There's a picture of Christmas that's happy. And that was a cultural challenge to Stalin that he couldn't allow to exist. And that's why he used the Yasha gang in Paris, who are outlined in the book, to kill her. Once we got to Pavlova and the organization of what was called Lab 1 by Stalin, it led us into the actual Soviet bioweapons production as late as the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and now begun again under Putin, outlined in other books by defectors like Kenneth Albeck. From there, we learned that there were huge biowar labs set up not only in the Soviet Union, but in China. And so that took us another year to do the research on China. And that's where the book came about and how the book in general came about.
Sarah, one of the things that struck me that I suppose it makes sense after the fact is the extent to which Stalin went to cover these things up. So you go through the creation of Lab 1, and then remarkably, all of the executioners, save just a very small number of them, were themselves executed. And this included even the scientists and the doctors who created a lot of these novel poisons. Was that something that, I mean, were you just stunned when you came across the evidence that that was what occurred?
We came across killing after
Yeah.
We came across killing after killing. He wanted to cover his tracks exclusively. He even did so with various poisons. Sometimes he would say, I want to be known for having killed this person to put fear into people. And then other times he would do it secretly through what we call Liternoi killings, Liternoi poisonings. And for instance, Chuck, if you had respiratory issues, then Chuck would come down with pneumonia, and that's too bad that he had respiratory issues, and it was actually anthrax. But no one would question that he'd been poisoned. Or, for instance, if you had heart issues, then you'd be given some other bacteria that would kill you that way.
You remember the old story in Treasure Island where the pirate takes the treasure and he buries it, and then they kill all the guys that buried it? That was Stalin. The Yasha gang was the poisoning mechanism he used in the 1930s. He summoned them back to Moscow in 1938, and he killed every single one of them. Their bodies lie somewhere in a mass grave in Russia, with one exception, and that's Yasha, who's outlined in the book. He did the very same thing with the Romanov killers, the people who actually killed the Romanovs in 1918, in the slaughter of the Romanov girls and the family. They were all executed 1921, 1922 in a monastery, a former monastery located near Moscow. It happened over and over again in the Soviet period.
Even at the high levels, Lenin was killed by Stalin. Beria killed Stalin and was then killed.
So let's talk about the timing of that. You just casually say, these two monsters, right? Lenin was killed by Stalin. What was Lenin going to do the day after he was killed?
Lenin had been shot, and so he was ill. He made the terrible
You tend to
mistake.
get ill after you're shot, I understand. That happens
Well,
sometimes.
Fanny Kaplan was the name of the woman who shot him, who was beaten up and then shot very quickly. So we never really know how Lenin got shot. But he got shot and he had to recover from that. He made a terrible mistake. His mistake was getting Stalin, whom he had a nickname for that's in the book, as his secretary. So Stalin controlled all access to Lenin. And he used that to build power. Well, finally, Lenin realized what was happening. So Lenin composed what was called his last testament. And he gave his last testament to his wife, the only other person with access to him besides Stalin. Stalin learned of the last testament, and Lenin's plan was to present it to a Soviet Party Congress in 1924. He went hunting, and then a day or two later, the day before he was supposed to present it, the last testament denounced Stalin and called for Stalin to be removed. The day before it was presented, Lenin suddenly and inexplicably died. Lenin had other physical problems, but pathology studies at the University of Maryland and conferences concluded that Lenin could not possibly have died of what it was claimed he died of. And so Lenin's serendipitous death, among a whole host of other deaths, a death that occurred right before he was going to denounce Stalin, suggests very strong evidence that Stalin killed Lenin.
And you even talk about in the book about how Lenin's brain was preserved in a jar, and even to this day, the Russian authorities let no one do any sort of analysis of it.
That's correct.
To find poisons that might still be there in the tissue.
In the old days, you used to go to Red Square, which I did at least a couple of times, and in there's a tomb of Lenin. Stalin used to be there, and then when he fell in disfavor, they took him out on Halloween night and buried him. And there are actors, one guy playing Stalin, another guy playing Lenin, and so on. I don't know if they're there anymore. I doubt it, in the Putin period. And I asked the Putin guy, the Stalin guy, did you kill Lenin? And he just sort of smiled. And I asked the Lenin guy, were you killed by Stalin? And he just sort of nodded yes, and so on. So the Soviet people sort of understand what happened.
So tell me about this guy that they nicknamed the Poison Dwarf. The thing that is interesting to me about this guy is the photograph of him with Stalin has become kind of a modern internet meme about kind of the George Orwell 1984 memory holding that happens today when people get canceled, right? Everyone's seen the picture. You've got Stalin and a couple of other people next to this canal with this small guy in a uniform, and then there's the same exact picture where the guy's been airbrushed out. And that's Nikolai Yezhov. And I never knew the connection between what he did for Stalin and the fact that got him executed.
Well, Yezhov worked in Laboratory 1, and he did such a fine job, he was put in charge of the entire KGB. Laboratory 1 was the secret laboratory that Stalin used to develop poisons and later bioweapons. It expanded into huge bioweapons facilities, beginning at a place called Saratov. And Stalin himself, as the book outlines, almost died in an inadvertent, perhaps unfortunate that he didn't die, leak that occurred in 1939. Yezhov was called the Poison Dwarf because he was so genuinely evil. Even people like Bukhar and Stalin's friends couldn't believe that they were around a person so evil. He was short in stature. He loved poisoning people himself. He loved beating people to death. He loved human misery. and so on. He's the one that conducted the purge trials of 1937 and 1938 in Russia, where most of the old Bolsheviks were actually executed, Bukharin and the rest of them. And at Stalin's birthday party, he pretended he was Bukharin and others, imitating their death and agony. So he was a supremely evil man. Of course, he himself, in the end, was destroyed and executed by Stalin in 1939 in order to conceal all the poisonings that he had been involved in.
So less people think this is all ancient history and this is all, Stalin consolidating power and acting on his paranoia, and as some apologists would say, although I guess today Putin's been working very hard to rehabilitate Stalin. Tell us about some of the latter Cold War period. So what ends up happening with Laboratory One is it ends up getting replicated. The Soviet Union begins to become even more sophisticated in its use of bioweapons. They start to realize the possibilities of mass casualties instead of just killing one or two people. So there's a few interesting things that happened in the 1970s. Can you tell us about some of these lab leaks that happened and what that indicated? What was it the Soviet Union was getting into?
There were 3 huge lab leaks of bioweapons that we were aware of in the 1970s. The first was in 1972 at Kiev, and these are all disclosed. What happened is the number 2 guy in the Soviet program defected. His name was Kenneth Albeck, and he wrote a book called Biohazards, which you can obtain. And the first of these was at Kiev, where anthrax is a set of bacterial spores, and introduced into a human lung, they mimic pneumonia, and the lungs fill up with water. They were incurable until the development of various types of treatments. In any event, there was a leak of anthrax out of the Kiev facility. It actually went into the sanitary sewer system and mutated into a form of anthrax that the Soviets, no fools, then turned and used as their primary form of anthrax. I think it was called anthrax 638, but it's in the book. In 1977, in China, in Western China, a flu appeared, and the flu went all over the world, and it was called the Russian flu, even though it had appeared in China. And scientists looked at it, and you can look it up on Wikipedia as the Russian flu. And when they looked at it, it was inexplicable because it was exactly the same flu that had existed in 1955 in an outbreak and then disappeared from the whole world. And so they said, this flu, as a matter of fact, if you were alive in 55, you never got the 77 flu because you were immune from it. So they said, someone has preserved this flu in a laboratory, and it has escaped. Chinese said, we have no idea what you're talking about. The Russians said, no, not us. Much later, scientists all over the world said it's chemically identical to the 1955 flu. Flus migrate, mutate. It's like John O'Neill going to law school 50 years ago, appearing today. It just can't happen. So somebody has to preserve this in a laboratory. And what happened is in 1994, the head of the Chinese virology program, outlined in the book, disclosed for the first time that the Chinese had preserved the 55 flu in a laboratory, that it leaked, that they were conducting vaccine trials to try and develop it as an effective bioweapon, and that they didn't know what they had in it. That's how it got out, and that's how 700,000 people died in the world. In 1979, exactly the same thing happened in the Soviet Union at a Kottenberg. It was called the bioweapons Chernobyl. In the bioweapons Chernobyl, anthrax escaped. You can read the journal of the people that worked on it. They talked about having to kill stray dogs and how silly that was because they all knew it was anthrax. It killed something like 11 or 1,200 people. We'll never know how many, because the Soviet Union at that time claimed it was just bad meat that someone had bought, and then they tried the butchers, amazingly. Those were 3 of the leaks.
So by blaming it on bad meat and rogue illegal butchers, that seems eerily familiar to a story that
I was
appeared
about to say, does
a
that
couple of
sound
years
familiar?
ago.
It was the wet market story. It was exactly the wet market story about 40 years earlier, and not particularly innovative. But you can read the actual accounts of in the journals that Middlebury College has actually done. You can read the account of Peter Police, who's the virologist who studied it and talked directly to the Chinese doctors who admitted that they were developing a bioweapon, developing vaccine to combat a bug that existed, a virus that existed only in their own labs.
Sarah, let's continue in the late 70s. There was a fascinating incident that happened, I believe, in London. And it just again outlines that sometimes a regime aims to make a public statement by just shooting someone in the open, and many times, though, a person just inexplicably gets sick and dies. Tell me about Georgie Markov and the umbrella. What was that all about?
Well, John can also speak to this, but sometimes they would, in that instance, there was poison on the end of an umbrella that he was poisoned with, but sometimes they were shot in the open, sometimes it was very secretive, so they had a number of ways in which they could administer these poisons.
Putin, has an operation that's outlined in the book. It's called, Sarah, what are the numbers?
Unit 29155 is their current operation.
29155 began killing people by 2004 in the Ukraine when Yushchenko, the president of the Ukraine, was poisoned with dioxin. You can see the pictures of him. You've probably seen them, the picture of the horrible looking guy, the real young guy, and then in 2 seconds, he's terrible looking. In 2006, they poisoned a guy in London. He was poisoned with Nabokov, which is a nerve poison that the Soviet Army uses. And on his deathbed, he said, the world will always know now that Putin is a poisoner. And they asked Putin, did you poison him? And Putin said, he's no Lazarus, he won't be coming back.
That's Alexander Litvinenko.
Litvinenko. There are similar poisonings in 2010, 11, and so on. Most recently, the way the group finally got is in England. They poisoned a family called the Skirples in 2018. Idiotically, they allowed themselves to be caught on video cameras, and a blogger was able to take the pictures of them and identify who they were. These idiots were posting on Facebook, unbelievably. And so the entire unit got identified. The British police, working backward, identified 14 different people that they had murdered in England alone. Most recently, there 8 different families have all died in the Soviet Union and in Spain. The most recent, a family called the Presenchas, they're all involved. They were all families involved with the Soviet oil and gas companies. Why he killed them, we won't know, but the typical is the Presencha family. Here's a family, husband, wife, little girl. Supposedly the husband chops up the wife and the little girl with a hatchet and then hangs himself. He's the eighth one in the string to do that. And if you believe that, you'll believe anything. Of course, this is a Liternoi murder. As they explain it, the function of a Liternoi murder is to stage a suicide that looks like a suicide or a natural death that people in Russia at least know isn't a natural death and it isn't a staged suicide. And so the murder of the Presenchas and the other 8 different families, all murdered in similar fashion, says to everybody in Russia, look, if you oppose Putin, you're not only going to die yourself, but your whole family's going to die. Your wife's going to die, and your little kids are going to die.
So let's address a critique, right? You'll have some people who will say, well, the CIA has done these sorts of things before, right? How are we any better than the old Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China? So what would you say to people who would bring up, for example, the CIA's several supposedly failed attempts to poison Fidel Castro, for example? What's the difference between the sort of activity that you outline in your book and that sort of thing?
Well, the first difference is in 1970, U.S. law was changed to outlaw any bioweapons, to outlaw any poisons. And in 1972, we entered a treaty that we would never do it. And there's absolutely no evidence that we've ever done it since then. Even before that time, our activities were small and minuscule. Castro, maybe a couple of other people. We killed Allende, likely killed Allende, or were behind his death. Ngozo Diem in South Vietnam. But we weren't killing hundreds of people. We weren't developing bioweapons to kill hundreds of thousands of people. So there was a tremendous difference in degree from the very beginning. When we entered the bioweapons treaty in 1972, we stopped, absolutely stopped any efforts of any kind. But as Albeck discloses in his book, that was not a stop for the Soviet Union. It was a starting point. And by the mid-1970s, they were spending more money on bioweapons than they were spending on nuclear weapons.
I think, there's also another difference as well, which we discussed a few minutes prior to going live, which is that you talk about the scale, but I remember, John, you had also said, if we had the ability to poison Hitler, of course, we would have done it, right? So there's a difference in intent, and you mentioned it insofar as the targeting, but when you look at, for example, Stalin going after a ballerina because the sort of cultural ambassador that she was represented a threat to the legitimacy of his rule and his regime. And so that's why you then see people like that and then their extended families all being killed as well. I mean, that seems to be just completely a different sort of activity.
Well, there is a huge difference. If you study the history of Marxism, you see that what happens is folks take over on a very idealistic basis. The economy collapses, life in general collapses, and people who are voting for freedom find themselves in slavery. And that's tragic. And then it ultimately collapses into usually a single ruler, whether it's Mao Zedong or Joseph Stalin, or today Putin in Russia, or Xi in China. And so the idea of a collective rule with great human freedom starts like that, but that's not how it ends. And Marxism is not capable of free debate because it fails so often. And that's why controlling the mind of man was so important to Stalin, and now to Xi in China and to Putin in Russia. That's why Xi in China is picking up 11 different actresses have all disappeared in China. That's why there is a massive disappearance of anybody that doesn't toe or seems to be incorrect on the right political line.
It does beg the question, why would Stalin want to kill a ballerina who seems harmless? But she traveled over 400,000 miles in the days before air travel with her dance, and she represented everything that Stalin couldn't stand. It was an independent, free thought. It was very much, he continued the doctrine of cultural hegemony that was first advanced by Gramsci. As John mentioned earlier, to control men, you have to control their mind, their thoughts, the music, everything. And she was a direct threat to that.
She actually went, they sent her mother from Russia to try and get her to come back. She wouldn't come back. They sent her an invitation to come back. She wouldn't come back. They declared in 1927 that she was an enemy of the Soviet people. And that didn't seem to faze her very much. In 1929, they seized the trust she had set up for little kids and for ballerinas in Moscow, and gave it to the Red Army on the ground she was now an enemy of the Soviet people. Stalin sent a woman who was likely his mistress, named Kollontai, around Europe to contact the Norwegians, Swedes, and other governments to try and stop them from allowing her to dance in their countries. So he went to great effort. 1930, her friends all tried to get her to come to Hollywood. She had many offers to make great movies in Hollywood. They were afraid for her, and she was afraid for herself. She said she felt a sword of Damocles coming down on her head, and she wouldn't. Instead, she scheduled a tour that was going to go right to the borders of the Soviet Union itself, to Poland, and that was the end of the line for her. She departed on the train to go to the very first performance in The Hague, and climbed on the train and said, "I was poisoned," and she died. And the very next night, because her friends, her company promised her that they went forward with the whole show. with a light shining on the spots where she would have been because there was no understudy who could take the place of Anna Pavlova because she was the greatest dancer in the world.
I believe there are 37 biographies written about her, and surprisingly, no one accused Stalin of poisoning her, even though she said, I was poisoned by the food I ate in Paris. And then when you do research and find the Yasha gang,
Right.
and the circumstantial evidence is remarkable.
The Yasha gang was concealed completely until the 1990s.
It'd be another 60 years, that's right, before it was disclosed.
So I'd like to ask one more question before we start asking for questions from the audience. And if I may, when we do go to questions for the audience, because C-SPAN is here, please wait to ask your question until the mic gets to you. And always, of course, in a question and a question mark. So if I can, Sarah, one of the things that struck me when we were talking ahead of time was that you had a finished book at one point, and then you thought, there's all these crazy things that have happened in the world that would seem to suggest, at least circumstantially, that governments might be involved in a way that they didn't want to admit to. Can you tell us a little bit about that process and what it was that you found regarding the current COVID-19 pandemic?
Here's what happened. COVID-19 happened. And so we said, we've got to add this into the book because we know it was a leak. It's the same leak that was encountered over and over again. We took the book to publishers and they said, well, we love your book. We'll pay a bunch of money for your book, but you can't talk about China in the book. You can't talk about COVID-19 in the book.
Or Putin, you said?
Or Putin. They didn't want Putin or Xi.
Any event. Then Sarah keeps our whole manuscript and all of our sources, some of which are fairly secret. But Sarah, tell them what happened then.
This was surprising. So I mentioned earlier, I'm an artist and sell in some galleries. I have a separate website, and I noticed in the course of writing this book, we have 650 endnotes. So I was doing lots of research, but noticed in the course of that my art website was getting hits from Wuhan and Shanghai. And I thought, well, that's disturbing. It has nothing to do with the book, and I don't have any clients in Wuhan and Shanghai. And so I didn't think anything of it. And then a couple of weeks later, didn't do anything about it, rather. A couple of weeks later, I began to work on the manuscript in the morning, and I was the only one that had access to it. John didn't even have access to it. And I noticed that my manuscript had been opened at 4 a.m.
At this point, we contacted the FBI. They said, get a good forensics expert. We got a good forensics expert. While he was studying it, and after making a copy of the hard drive, Sarah, tell him what happened.
So then, in a similar manner, I opened the manuscript to work on it one morning, and I would always save the manuscripts by a date because we'd make changes and then we'd want to add back in what we'd deleted and whatnot. They were all gone, all deleted. And if I hadn't saved it on a flash drive, we would have lost at least a year's worth of work. And so at that point, we contacted the FBI, and we already had my hard drive and my Wi-Fi passwords and everything with the computer forensic expert. And so he ran 1,000 tests that I didn't even know were possible, got Apple involved. They ran tests. They were able to discover that the breach happened in the Apple iCloud, which should hit home. Who here does not save their data in
Understand
the
what
Apple
they were doing
iCloud?
is coming from the Apple iCloud down into Sarah's computer.
And so
Oh, great.
that's right. And so anyway, we were able to determine the breach happened there as opposed to my home Wi-Fi system or hard drive, and that most likely it happened from China.
And there's no way to prove who got into the Apple iCloud, but there's only one country in the world with the capability of actually doing it. So I guess, we have a very strong guess.
In fact,
that
I
Chairman Xi didn't like our book.
wasn't going to put my name on the book. I love working with John. It's my second book to work on with him. But the subject matter was frightening. So I thought, I'm going to help you, but I'm going to stay anonymous on this one. And then once my computer was hacked and the manuscripts were deleted, I thought, well, they know who I am now. I might as well put my name on the book.
So talk a little bit about that, though, the specific issue. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of controversy about gain of function research. Where has that been done here in the US or farmed out to China? The fact that you have this very advanced level 4, I guess it's a level 4, right? Virology
Biosafety
lab,
level 4 lab.
in Wuhan, just coincidentally where the outbreak starts. So talk to the skeptics. Why do you think that there's a connection between this global pandemic that's caused trillions of dollars worth of economic harm and millions of people dying? Why Why is it Wuhan that you think this may have come from?
Sarah's going to speak a little bit to the newly discovered physical evidence, but let's start off with the obvious. We've known for a long time that there's a huge military lab in Wuhan. Our book attaches the appendix from 2004 and 5 that locate the big military lab, not the Wuhan virology lab, but the big military bioweapons lab in Wuhan. So it's been there. Now, understand what happens. This virus appears for the very first time and only time in nature immediately outside the Wuhan military lab and the Wuhan virology lab in Wuhan, China. Doesn't exist and has never been located anywhere in nature, anywhere else. It is similar to a bat virus, but not identical. 96.2% of it is the same as a horseshoe bat from the Himalayas, and 3.8% of it has never been found anywhere in nature. The bat was brought to Wuhan in 2015. We know that because they published articles saying we brought it to Wuhan. Boy, we're really proud of having this bat. And
The scientist is even nicknamed Batwoman. It's very well documented.
so they brought that bat to Wuhan and were experimenting. The next piece of evidence is that they were doing so-called gain-of-function research in Wuhan, meaning they were actually taking viruses and changing them, and Sarah's going to talk to this in a second. The very next thing that happens is in 2018, it now develops, there was actually a application by the Wuhan lab with the US government to actually place the hook, the 3.8%, almost exactly the 3.8%, in a bad virus. A year before this all came out. That's in an article by Dr. Jeffrey Sachs that's recently come out in the Journal of the American Academy of Science. All right. The thing now happens. It's 2019, December. A doctor discovers it. He puts it on the internet. He says there's a new virus here in Wuhan. And you know what they do? They put him in jail for disclosing state secrets.
And he dies shortly
They
thereafter.
release him and they say, oh, he died of the COVID-19 virus, which kills 1.5% of people his age. All the other guys mostly die. All the samples are destroyed. All the early forensic samples are destroyed by the Chinese military bioweapons command, which immediately goes into Wuhan. There is no Dr. Fauci in Wuhan. These are all General such and so on. And they go in and shut down the city of Wuhan and destroy all evidence of what actually happened in Wuhan.
The World Health Organization doesn't begin their search for an entire year afterwards. Of course, everything's been destroyed. As John mentioned, the people in charge of the search are all appointed by the Chinese Communist Party. All of the
In
people
law, we
Americans
used
are
to call
rejected.
it recita loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. If you try, John Stewart said, if there's chocolate goo on the foot of the Hershey factory in Hershey, Pennsylvania, it's crazy to think that it's a cocoa bean emigrating from Brazil. Understand these bats are from 1,100 miles away and their normal range is 20 miles. And none of these bats have ever been located within 500 miles of Wuhan, China, except in that lab. No other, never, not in history. A search has gone on for them. A search has gone on for the COVID virus. We've spent millions. Doesn't exist anywhere.
Over 80,000 animals have been tested.
And never exists, can't be found anywhere. So it's a created virus that has that leaked out of the people that created it. And why don't you go through the Jeffrey Sachs's?
Sure. So Sachs's article that came out in June of this year called for an independent investigation of American institutions and universities that could have evidence leading to the origin of COVID. Interestingly, he was able to show that the COVID spike protein that you hear about, the furin cleavage site that is 12 bars of RNA long exactly, which that kind of precision you don't find in nature, however, is easy to manufacture in a lab. But also interestingly, it has a string of 8 amino acids that is identical to those found in human lung cells. going back to what John said, in 2018, 3 organizations, the University of North Carolina, who invented the CRISPR tool, the gene editing tool, the Wuhan Institute of Virology that we've heard a lot about, and the Eco Health Alliance, applied for a grant from the Department of Defense to insert a furin cleavage site that's identical to what is found in COVID-19. That was exactly a year before. They were rejected because that's illegal in the United States. And then 1 year later, it shows up. We also know that those 3 organizations had worked together in 2014 to increase the transmissibility of bat coronaviruses, and then invented in 2016 a virus using a spike protein of a bat coronavirus that had been isolated by the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Some of this is new information since our book was published. The truth has a tendency, even if you slaughtered the people involved, like Stalin did, like Xi does, to sort of come out over a period of time. I think another very important thing for you all to understand is until the CRISPR tool was created, CRISPR allows you to actually edit viruses for the first time in human history, at least in the West, actually edit viruses and create new viruses. Before this time, the Soviets were dealing with plague. They were dealing with anthrax. They were dealing with viruses that actually exist in nature, and how do you weaponize those? Maybe you try and get the most virulent stream of them. They had an island actually called Rebirth Island that's outlined in the book, but they couldn't actually create new viruses. And understand what we're dealing with is the first man-made, non-natural virus that the world has ever actually seen. It's the first instance of this ever happening.
We
know about.
hear a lot about the risk of nuclear war, and obviously that's very frightening. But I think most of the world doesn't understand the threat of this biochemical war. Even, I believe it was in an election debate in 2014, Putin was criticized because his army was in disarray. And he said, yes, but you know nothing of our bioweapons capabilities. It's a really frightening subject. That's one reason we wrote the book, is to honor those that he had killed, but also to make the public aware of what's happening.
So what was the Russian dark humor behind the name of the island, Rebirth Island?
Well, they would go and bomb, they would put animals, monkeys and goats and so on this island, and they would bomb it with the plague, or bomb it with Ebola, or bomb it with various types of diseases. And when the animals died off, they put more animals on the island. This is all in Albeck's book. And occasionally, fishermen would come down with pneumonic plague, which is an unheard of disease, for hundreds of years. We didn't tell the story, but in 1939, in the Soviet Union, Stalin and Beria summoned the head of their bioweapons project, a guy named Abram Berlin, in from Saratov for an emergency meeting in Moscow. When he got to Moscow, he began coughing at the Hotel Nacional, and they brought a doctor in, and they said, "My God, Abram, you've got pneumonic plague. There's no cure for it. We haven't seen it in hundreds of years." Everybody died. The hotel got shut down. They said, well, it's just a plumbing failure. It's a shame he didn't get a chance to meet with Stalin directly, but he didn't. So it represents a tremendous threat to mankind that's much worse since CRISPR came about.
All right, we're going to go to questions now, and I'm going to take one from our internet audience first, and then we'll go to questions in the audience. And so someone who's watching us online asks, where can people who are interested in the Anna Pavlova story find more information?
Well, in our book, there are
The Dancer and the Devil.
There are 37 great biographies of Anna Pavlova. Not 37 great ones. There are 3 great ones. There's a wonderful, the greatest is the story by her husband. He loved her deeply, and when you read his biography about her dying, it's very, very sad. And he tells the story of her in Mexico, which we haven't had time to tell. There's a great one by the great ballerina, Margot Fonteyn, who wrote only one book about Anna Pavlova. Those are great sources of other information. You can also look at online, if you put in Anna Pavlova, The Dying Swan, you'll see the actual film that John Barrymore and Mary Pickford did of Anna Pavlova when they were trying to convince her not to go back to Russia and to make a movie in 1929. It's
You
about
can
3
also
minutes
find
long.
black and white images of her dancing the swan that she was so famous for doing. And interestingly, we found, we did a book launch at the Houston Museum of Natural Science when the book came out a couple months ago. And we found a video to close the presentation with ballerinas all over the world dancing the dying swan for COVID relief. So if you do some research, you can find some wonderful things about her.
Wow. All right, so audience, now is your chance to shine. So please raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone. All right.
Anyone? Here's one.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
The timeline between the events, these individual events happening, and then when the information is coming to surface in the sources that you guys are finding is very interesting. Have y'all found or seen any correlation between how long it takes between that to happen? Is it coming to surface quicker nowadays? And if not, do you have any ideas on how we can be more proactive in finding out the truth of the events more quickly?
I don't know. It took the original, let's say the murders in Russia and in Paris, took 60 years before the documents ever came out. The murder of the Romanovs, no one really solved until the 1990s. They were murdered in 1918. They, of course, they burned their bodies and put their bones in a mine, and then they shot all the people who were actually involved in shooting them. And no one really knew what happened until DNA testing came about in 1991. I do think the of this gang of Putin's is very hopeful. Once again, I think it's
29155.
29155. They were able to identify these guys by video cameras in England, and then just a regular old blogger was able to take that image and find out who they were, and then that's allowed the world to track them all over the world. Putin's response when he was confronted was to say, there is no such unit. They were only on vacation, but there should be such a unit. We should have a unit like that. That was his actual response. So it's not an easy question. The problem you've got, the Wuhan virus showed up in Wuhan. I don't think they ever intended for it to get released in Wuhan. But understand, with these weapons, you can have somebody cough in Kansas, and that's what you know about it. All of a sudden, the deal showed up in Kansas, or rust shows up on wheat in Nebraska, and that's about what you know. They're very difficult to trace. It's very difficult to find out what happened.
Or a water source is contaminated, but to your question, bringing it current day about recent events, for instance, the Sachs article coming out last month, I think we're seeing more and more in the news evidence of the lab leak theory being correct. Actually, Sean Hannity early on mentioned the lab leak theory and was raked across the coals for it. And actually, Dr. Francis Collins, who's head of the NIH, approached Dr. Fauci and said, what should we do about this? What can the NIH do to squash this? And he said, I wouldn't do anything about it. It's a shiny object that's going to go away. And it's not going away. So I think in the news, you're going to start to see more and more people who no longer label it a conspiracy theory. But when you add up all the circumstantial evidence, I mean, John and I had fun writing the last chapter of the book. Both as lawyers, we wrote it like a closing argument. And there's just an abundant amount of evidence.
There were a lot of other brave people, like Nicholas Wade, a reporter for the Washington Post. He had to self-publish his own book because they wouldn't, nobody would publish the book. And all he was doing is giving the undisputed facts that we've sort of gone over. And there are a whole sequence, there always were. In 1931 to 1934, Stalin killed 4 million, somewhere between 4 and 8 million people in the Ukraine. They call it the Great Famine. And a reporter for the New York Times, Walter Devaney, won the Pulitzer Prize for reporting that there was no famine in the Ukraine. And the guy who showed up and reported that there was, Gareth Jones, he was dismissed as a nut. And he was actually shot in 1935 by the communists in China. So it takes a while for the truth to come out. There was a famine in the Ukraine. 4 to 8 million people died in the Ukraine. That happened. And all the Pulitzer Prizes in the world don't eliminate the truth of what actually occurred. And there's always a Gareth Jones somewhere in the world. Maybe he's a Nicholas Wade, or maybe he's Jeffrey Sachs, who ideology is not the important thing, but they have a commitment to truth itself.
And more people are defecting. A lot of our evidence in the books comes from defectors who, one woman actually worked in the lab and told us what was happening, and she escaped, but her family is all missing. So there are these brave souls that are out there reporting the truth.
It's interesting you mentioned Jeffrey Sachs's article, because as I recall, he has this letter or this call to American institutions about what they may have done. It's what's interesting is that the Chinese Communist Party controlled papers in China then pointed at his claims as saying it was the Americans who created the virus.
That was interesting. That just came out last week.
Yes.
Because I remember seeing headlines and it said, no, new evidence out that COVID-19 was created in a lab, in a US lab, I'm sorry. And I went, whoa, this is something I haven't heard before. So I start pouring over, reading all the articles I can find. What they said was the technology was created in a lab, which we don't doubt. That CRISPR tool was created at the University of North Carolina. There's no evidence that COVID-19 was created in a Wuhan lab.
Understand what happened.
In an American lab.
The Obama administration outlawed gene enhancement in 2015. That was very frustrating to some US scientists. They thought that you ought to be able to enhance the infection of viruses so that in laboratories, you could sort of get things infected better and you can anticipate other things.
Create vaccines.
But it was outlawed here, so it's a felony to do it. 2018, the Wuhan lab, together with 2 American institutions, show up and they propose that the Department of Defense fund the creation of this hook, the enhancement of that virus. They say, no, we're not doing it. A year later, it shows up. The claim is not that North Carolina created this or did it. The claim is that the technology was US technology. It was shared with the Chinese and then used by the Chinese, not for beneficent purposes, but for the creation of bioweapons in China.
It all centers around this, what you've heard, this furin cleavage site. And there's a family of coronaviruses. I think it's called the Sarbeco virus family. And none of those SARS viruses have a furin cleavage site, not one of them. So
We have another question from the audience here down front.
Hi, thank you all for being here. So despite the fact that COVID is still going on, we're hearing a lot of new news about other viruses that are also popping up, specifically monkeypox. And I was wondering if you guys had done any research on whether that was manufactured or if it's a bioweapon, or if you have suspicions. What are your thoughts?
I haven't done any research on that. We sort of have our hands full with coronavirus. People don't realize coronavirus, it hadn't gone away. It's only gone away in the newspapers. There are 120,000 people every single day coming down for the first time with coronavirus right now. There are about 400 to 500 people every single day dying of coronavirus. In other words, somewhere around 10,000 people a month are dying from coronavirus. More people than all the gun shootings and the 10 times the gun shooting. More people than almost any other single cause. And it looks like it's going to be a deal that's with us for a long time because it's continuing to mutate. That's why it isn't, like Fauci said, a shining object that's going to disappear. I wish it were, but it hasn't disappeared. They're killing people every single day.
John and I are from Houston, and I just read an article in the Houston Chronicle. They'll test wastewater for the presence of the coronavirus or for COVID-19. It's 635 times higher in July of 2022 than it was in July of 2020. So it's most definitely not going away.
We have a question from online that bears, it's a good follow-on for your question. And it's a tough one, I think. It's why is there no accountability for those responsible for the pandemic and the fallout? Is there anything that can be realistically done?
I think the very first thing that has to be done is we have to tell the truth. I mean, it sounds silly, but we have to actually get to the truth of it. And the truth of it is it started in China, in Wuhan, China. It's a created virus. It was leaked in Wuhan, China.
There was a mass cover-up.
and there's been a massive cover-up of what happened. Once you do that, we need to enforce the 1972 Bioweapons Convention. We can't let 2/3 of American pharmaceuticals be manufactured as they are right now in China. If China has 15 major bioweapons facilities, they don't go out of the bioweapons business, they're out of the US pharmaceutical business. So there are all kinds of steps we can take once we just realize our ally is the truth.
And right now, we don't even have access to the biosafety level 4 lab, the military lab that we're talking about. Sometimes that's confusing when we give talks. You hear about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but there's an adjacent level 4, which is the highest level biosafety lab. And the WHO was never allowed to investigate that. We don't know what's going on in there. Most likely things much more dangerous than COVID-19 because we're not allowed any access to it.
Wow. Do we have any idea the level of personnel in that lab compared to the so-called civilian lab?
I don't.
No, well, understand that in 1972, China, under Deng Xiaoping, a major opponent of bioweapons, supposedly at that time, signed a treaty together with Russia, together with us, that outlawed all these activities. So all these activities are a total violation of international law. They're a violation of treaty obligations under the 1972 treaty, a total violation of it. While we went to sleep, I'm afraid these fellas didn't, particularly in the Putin-Xi period.
Another frightening thing in the course of our research, we discovered that the Russian army trains 1 out of 5 days in full hazmat suits. And the only reason that they would do that would be if they themselves were preparing to initiate some type of biochemical attack.
And I can assure you those chemical, nuclear, biological suits are very uncomfortable. And I can also assure you that the Russian version is even more uncomfortable than the American version, because the one we use is cloth with a charcoal activated lining that allows for some breathing, and it's disposable. Basically, you wear it for a certain period of time, and you throw it away and burn it. But the Russian one has like a rubberized cover over it, meaning that you can't really sweat, and it's made to last longer, but it's terribly difficult to work in.
We found pictures of it in the publication Russia Today.
Right. Yeah, well, that makes sense.
Whose editor is now in jail.
Whose editors now
I think we
change.
have time for one more question from the audience, if we have one from the audience. Otherwise, we do have more questions online.
There's one over here.
Oh, here, they're very excellent. Thank you.
Just a short question. So how was this technology that was developed in the United States ever made available to China for them to use?
The theory was that there was a tremendous, almost a lobby in favor of gene enhancement in the United States. The theory, and it wasn't bad thinking, it was bad thinking, but it was for good reasons. The theory was, look, if we can enhance genes, viruses, if we can edit the viruses to make them more communicable in a lab, why heck, we can do in a day what used to take us months. Also, we can use gene enhancement to see what viruses are going to mutate into. And then instead of being surprised by some horrible virus that shows up, well, we'll be prepared because we've already looked at it in a lab. And there was a great scientific debate between 2012 and 2015 in the United States, and it was ended in the Obama administration over the opposition, I may add, of the NIH in particular. And the conclusion was it's banned in the United States, no gene enhancement in the United States. It's too dangerous, and so on. And it looks like what actually happened is people took the very same technology and the same idea and decided we'll try and do it in China at US expense, except it never got funded by the US.
Well, and we know that those 3 organizations have worked together. There's a man named Dr. Barrick at the University of North Carolina who's very educated in bat coronaviruses and gene enhancement of them. We know that, I think I mentioned earlier, in 2016, those 3, the EcoHealth Alliance, UNC, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology actually created a new virus using the spike of a bat coronavirus that was isolated by the WIV. So they have experience working together with this CRISPR.
In China, there's no evidence to be clear that the University of North Carolina ever violated the law in the United States or that Dr. Barrett did.
No, I was just, he's very
The-
educated in the topic and
The technology was developed there, and then like so much U.S. technology, it migrated to Wuhan, China, and it wasn't being used to just do happy things in Wuhan. It was being used for bioweapons.
Well, John O'Neill and Sarah Wynne, the book is The Dancer and the Devil, Stalin, Pavlova, and the Road to the Great Pandemic. And the authors will be available outside in our lobby to provide copies of the book that have been signed,
That's right.
personally signed. They'll be selling some of their books out in the lobby. And to you here with us and those watching us on the live stream, as well as the C-SPAN audience, thank you so much for joining us today for this book talk at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I'm Chuck DeVore. Please have a great afternoon.
thank you, Chet.